We discuss application security a lot on this show, and we know that the implications for code security have become even greater as cloud adoption accelerates software development. Shift Left bridges the gap between security teams and developers to find and fix vulnerabilities accurately from the source. Shift Left Core is an innovation in code security with industry-leading accuracy and speed. It combines next-generation static code analysis, intelligent software composition analysis, secrets detection, security insights, and contextual developer security education in one easy-to-use platform. Learn more and create your free account at securityweekly.com/shiftleft. Whether you need to manage bots, protect cloud applications at runtime, stop form-jacking attacks, or secure your web applications and APIs, only Imperva offers a unified solution to protect from edge to application and data in one tool. Imperva helps you achieve more, save money, and become more efficient with fewer security vendors needed. Start a free trial today to easily protect your apps and website with Imperva. Learn more at securityweekly.com/Imperva. In any business today, there comes a moment, the moment you realize you can secure the code as fast as you write it. Instead of testing everything, you can just test the right things. It's not about tools, but intelligent risk management. That's the moment you choose Synopsys. Build secure, high-quality software faster. Visit securityweekly.com/Synopsys. Is your mobile app really secure? New vulnerabilities pop up every day, and malicious actors look for easy targets on app marketplaces to exploit. Securing your app's valuable IP and data is critical. GuardSquare security solutions are built for developers and protect your app at every stage in the development lifecycle. Multiple layers of protection prevent reverse engineering and automatically detect tampering, making your app a difficult target for attackers. Learn more at securityweekly.com/GuardSquare.
Welcome back to Application Security Weekly. I'm your host, Mike Shima, joined by John Kinsella. Security Weekly Unlocked will be held in person this December 5th through 7th at the Hilton Lake Buena Vista. We'll have keynotes from Melissa Miller, John Strand, Leslie Carhart, and Dave Kennedy. Visit securityweekly.com/unlocked to register and check out our exciting lineup. Also, join us October 21st to learn why zero-knowledge encryption matters. If you missed any of our previously recorded webcasts or technical trainings, they are available for your viewing pleasure at securityweekly.com/on-demand. And this, Mr. Kinsella, brings us to the news. Glad to have you back again with us to talk about all things news. I don't think we have too much on the Microsoft side of things, so hopefully we'll protect your brain a bit. But we might as well start off with two articles about Apple. I've got one and you've got one, but you've got one about cross-site scripting. So tell us what cool and complex and highly sophisticated cross-site scripting vulnerability has been discovered.
Oh, man. I think the folks down in Cupertino decided to try and play catch up with the folks in Redmond. I don't know. Maybe the planets aligned. This one's. There's three actually. I decided not to put in the third. I only wanted to cause so much focus on a particular single vendor. But so this one is interesting. We talked previously about Apple AirTags. Came out earlier this year. Seemed like neat things. My friends seem to be really into them. But the way the AirTag works, and this goes for anything, right? The nice thing about this particular vulnerability is it's a learning example for all sorts of folks. So with the AirTag, if it is, you have the ability to put it into lost or missing mode. So if someone else finds it and they bring their phone to it, it will pop up. I can't remember the exact details, but the idea is it'll say, hey, this is the person's phone number, or click on this link to go over to the Apple site and find out how to contact them. So it turns out that field is whatever a user puts in, and there's no sanitization, or at least decent filtering, and everyone knows where I'm going with this. So you bring that up on someone's phone, they click on the link to go where we're supposed to be able to go, and there's now the ability to do either credential hijacking or redirection or any of the fun games we've been doing with cross-site scripting for about the last 10, 15 years now. So it seems like they didn't think about it at all. They just put a field there where someone could put a value into it and they said, hey, Bob's your uncle. And now we've got all those things floating around out there, and hopefully you're not going to be able to fix it easily on the AirTag side of things. I mean, maybe you can do a firmware update, I guess, possibly, but it would be quite simple for them to update found.apple.com to do some filtering after the fact on the rendering side. And as of the last time I heard about this, the story's about a week old. They haven't started doing that yet, so maybe they'll sort of catch up a little bit. But yeah, that's our first one for today. Let's see if we can go uphill or downhill from there.
Yeah, and I thought, I was going into this thinking, ooh, there would be something clever and cool, and it was just a script tag and a phone number. It's kudos to the research to discover it, but that does seem a little bit of, wait, that's a dead simple is my term of art for that, and just going to have to shake my head. Of just being frustrated, I'll say, to see those types of vulns still be apparent and present.
Yeah, and just for our listeners, I think most. That's one of the problems with this is I bet most of our listeners can guess how to fix this right now, but we want to try and keep this educational. We're not here for entertainment. We're not here just to bitch at vendors.
Right.
But that's a fairly simple thing for someone to go through on either side. Like I just said, you can either, when you're taking that input from the user, let's filter and sanitize, or at least to return an error message then saying, hey, you can't use those characters, as that's not as easy to do as it sounds, but you can do that. Or on the reverse side, escape and encode everything left and right possible, so that even if someone has the best cross-site scripting example in there, still make sure that what you're actually rendering back out on that API call, not the browser, but on the API call, is fairly sanitized. So that's why we are starting our segment here with so many eye rolls. So as I said, we'll see what we go from here.
We see where we can go, but we will do a callback to the opening segment of October. And when I was recommending FIDO only for your MFA, because in this case, there's the vulnerability and then there's the exploit. The exploit in this particular article was calling attention to credential theft. But if you have multi-factor authentication enabled for your iCloud account, yes, it's going to be bad, I will agree, to lose your credentials, especially if you've made the mistake of reusing them elsewhere, for example, in your email account. But if you have multi-factor authentication enabled, you probably, or you very should be strongly protected against that particular type of attack. So it's still something that should be fixed, but you as the end user can still also protect yourself from the faults of software. And that's a general comment. And the reason I wanted to highlight that is talking about what can be done on the exploit side of vulnerabilities, because I think that's a segue into this other article that I picked out about Apple Pay Express Transit. And here some researchers had a pretty neat research article. There's a PDF linked to in the show notes that basically says they can spoof what a transit terminal looks like, and then collect payments from a iPhone. Now, the article I linked to is a pretty concise threat model summary of that. I think I pretty strongly agree with, at least for the moment. We'll see how what John does to convince me of what the issue is. Basically, there is a usability, a user experience design in this particular feature. You don't want to slow people down as they're trying to exit from transit stations, especially in the underground, in the London Underground. It gets pretty crowded as is. So the design choice was you don't need to unlock in order to pay for transit, because that unlock step, you either have to hold it up to your face or do something else that's going to slow things down. So that's one setup right there. So I'm going through the business context of a bit of why the design is like this. But then there is this attack, which the researchers figured out. They say, I can be a transit terminal, and I'm going to charge $1,000 transaction to this locked iPhone and collect money. What then the counter to that is to say that vulnerability may exist, but payments can be a complex system, or I should say payments are a complex system. And in this case, Visa is making the assertion that they have other controls that would make it either very hard to successfully get the money out of this type of transaction. So you could execute transactions, but you may not be able to get your hands on the cash as the outcome of it. And they're also saying that the user may be inconvenienced by this. Obviously, it's not going to be happy to lose £1,000. but they're not going to be, they'll be refunded with that. So that was my probably longer description than the article is to set up the threat model and figure out how much should we worry about this, how much should we fix this, or do we have mitigating controls that we might rely on? So that's where I'm going to set up, and let's see what John can do to tear it apart in an educational way.
Mm-hmm. No, I think you did a pretty good job there. I was just sort of browsing the article while you're talking, and yeah, so that it's an interesting. It's sort of, as far as Visa is concerned, it's funny money, right? At this point, because we're staying within their little pool until someone manages to not either one way or another transfer that to either another Visa account. I don't think you can do Visa transfers, but either until they get that out of Visa system to a bank account, it's funny money. So they don't care what happens. They can reverse that charge quite easily. So that's interesting. I think I'd want to see like maybe GPS coordinates around it to try and minimize, because I could see, me having the way I think, have a backpack with a fake terminal and just walk down the aisle of a train, especially during crowded time. Like think like the Japanese trains, right? You could sort of just run right through there. But so that I could see doing the bypass attacks, the walk-by attacks. That being interesting. But yeah, I mean, Visa's had for ages this ability, or not ability, their, what's the phrase they use here? Sorry, I just used their phrase, zero liability policy. In other words, up to a certain limit, I think they're saying here, I think $1,000. No, it's here, £1,000. So within that, they'll cover for that. So I think you're mitigating a security issue with a monetary policy. Which is interesting. You're big enough and you own that system, you own that network, so it's when you own network, so I think that's okay. I guess let's look at it from the opposite direction. Could you say that your iPhone actually wasn't tagging on a real turnstile and that someone was tampering with your phone and those charges aren't from you? That'd be interesting. I'm not sure if the value is large enough there, and there's probably a good amount of human work to do that, and they'll make it sort of painful for you. So it's an interesting way to deal with it. I'd rather see some sort of crypto on that contact process and actually have that bit signed a little bit better. But yeah, not horrible.
No, not horrible. And I think, and I like where you're going. To be clear, the crypto was cryptography there.
Yes.
And I think it's sort of like we were just talking about cross-site scripting in the other article, and there's reflected cross-site scripting and there's stored cross-site scripting, which could be a bit more consequential as demonstrating credential theft. Still bugs to address, and you suggested some interesting ideas here too about ways to harden this process and build better attestation between the terminal and the iPhone around this. But yeah, I think it's a good type of item to bring up, because I think threat modeling isn't always so stark that here is the vuln to fix, go forth and fix it. And I think that's one of the other reasons I wanted to bring up this article, is to get the AppSec teams, AppSec mentality out of the idea that everything must be fixed now. Let's add some business context. Let's talk about how do we figure out how to get to that prioritization to say, development team, this is something that needs to be fixed in the next sprint versus this is something that maybe needs to be fixed in the next quarter or even next year for that matter. So that's one of my ulterior motives. On ulterior motives, another one is to figure out, do I care about vulns? So prototype pollution. I've heard about this for quite a while, not because I'm smart, just because I'm paying attention to Black Hat conferences, for example. And I think we've seen the array prototype be manipulated by Jeremiah Grossman at least 10 years ago, if not longer than that. And it's always been a pretty clever and interesting vulnerability to me, because it's taking advantage of some really fundamental ways that JavaScript works. And in this article, the researchers had some great links to examples of consequential prototype pollution vulnerabilities as well as a good walkthrough of how they pulled off some additional research to find, I think, 18 vulnerable libraries and 80 or so vulns, as well as collecting quite a bit of bug bounties along the way. But here's an example that if we're talking about threat models, I kind of want to come around to the idea of why does this design pattern of turning your URL parameters into basically a JavaScript object exist? This seems like a capability that's possible and kind of a fun thing to work all within JavaScript, but it doesn't seem like a compelling solution to any particular use case, because it's introducing this type of vulnerability with the way protos and object inheritance works within JavaScript, all for the sake of here's a key value pair coming out of our URL or coming out of a payload. So that's my that's my thought of it, is why do we have this design in the first place? John, what do you think about this?
Ease, right? A lot of this comes down to ease. So I haven't looked at this as nearly as closely as I want to. And one thing I wish they had said, they do. Okay. I was going to say, I wish they had said up front, I was like, when I was first scanning through this, I'm like, they're talking about JavaScript prototypes, right? And yes, they are. This looks like a good read. It's fairly long, and lots of researchers are taking part of it, and unfortunately, I just didn't have the time. But familiar with the concept, and I think sort of bringing it back around to what you were just asking. The next article I have in here will sort of foreshadow on that. But like, what's a developer trying to do, right? I mean, I'm running into this a tiny bit in Go. So in Go, you also have the ability to it's more just purely like manifestation of a string into a JSON string, say, for example, into a structure. And why do you do that, right? It is because I'm using a library. I mean, in this case, it's built into the language, but you're using something so that I don't have to go and parse the JSON and go, okay, well, let's see, I've got quotes here, and I got a colon, and I got another value and said quotes, and then a comma. And instead of doing all that type of thing, not just being able to just quickly manifest that into some sort of object, but actually into the object which I'm using internally. There's, at least on the Go side, there's value behind it because I know what that structure is internally and I can control it. So if someone tries to put a value in which is not within those particular parameters which I'm expecting, I shouldn't say parameters, that's going to confuse, within that structure which I'm using, it'll either error out or something's going to happen. It's not going to work, right? If they add another value which is in a different field, it's just going to be ignored. So it's nice from that point of view, and it's relatively clean. That's not all the validation we're doing, but that's a pretty good chunk of it. But in this case, it's that same type of thing. Is you're getting going. You want to have, like, you see always the examples of Amazon's pretty horrible about this right now. Of the example, at least that's what the one I'm seeing. Other examples are for like the easy use case, right? So I want to start a Lambda function and I want to be able to parse the first 2 or 3 parameters. Well, okay, here you go, sir. Here's, you proxy in your request through an API gateway. It's going to come in as a some sort of a Lambda request. I'm going to hand it over to this particular item, which is going to consider a prototype and take the parameters and put them into it. And it's easy, we'll get the website up and going in 5-10 minutes. And that sounds very attractive to any of us at first when we're starting to get going with this stuff. Until then you look at it a little bit closer, you're like, oh, that was the basic example. Well, I want to do something more advanced. Where's the example for that? Oh, it doesn't exist. Okay, Stack Overflow, where else do I go? And I think that's a decent chunk of it. Is like, how do you get going? How do you bootstrap up in these things which, we go to college hopefully to learn how to learn, not so much to learn how to program in Pascal or Fortran or whatever language we use whenever we're there. Right. But how do you actually run with these things? So I think I suspect that's a large chunk of this type of thing. And, everyone knows our thoughts on JavaScript. It'd be interesting to see what happens with this type of stuff. Yeah, no mention of TypeScript. It'd be interesting to see what happens with TypeScript. And I guess TypeScript is going to, it's going to render down to JavaScript anyways, so, or compile down. I don't want to get the word people coming after me. It's going to compile down to JavaScript, but still,
It does. And I think, I was peeking at, the latest ECMA script, to be super clear about what we're looking at too, the ECMA script standard, to see what it's talking about, freezing an object and things like that. But I think fundamentally my philosophy is coming around to, I don't object to the marshalling and unmarshalling of URL parameters into an object. For example, protobufs are actually really good about this. They can be pretty complex, but they have some good security features built in, whereas doing this with JavaScript JavaScript objects, there's a lot more potential to make mistakes, and that's more of what I'm objecting to, is that we're sort of misusing something that is going to make things potentially worse, harder to secure. At least it's not XML, so I will give them that, but it's not JavaScript. But I think, John, you were also saying, you were alluding to another article that you had captured for this week that I also think turns us from, once again, talking about vulns onto the developer's perspective, or what can we do, what can we think about to make software more secure. And we're starting off with the premise, which I think is really good, that we really want to highlight, is that maybe, not even maybe, it's developers do care about security. So tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, so this is not a new article, older one. I've been doing a little bit of navel gazing and head scratching over the last week for a few different things. But one of the ones, this is from 2019, 13 things developers do, 13 things that keep us motivated as software developers, right? And go back and think when you're starry-eyed and, starting your career, or maybe some of you still are starting your career, and like what actually excites you? What are you trying to do? Changing the world is great, and like a lot of us like that, and money's great, and a lot of us like that. But really, what keeps us going day in, day out? So it's a list of 13 things. And some of them are really basic. I think some will. I don't think this list is going to all apply to a single person, which is what is sort of cool about it. They got number one. I'm not sure if this is order, but number one is creating something, which I know, to me, that's hugely resonates, right? Like actually creating something from nothing. I'm a startup guy, right? I mean, I've been doing this for a decade. Creating a product from nothing and actually seeing that thing materialize, super cool. Making a work of art, some days I'll let myself do that, some days no. Learning new stuff, right? I've had guys working for me in the past, and like, I love you, I want you to stay working for me, how can I keep you happy? And I've multiple people who worked with me have been like, John, as long as we're learning something and actually doing something new and interesting, we're here. Which is, as a manager, it's cool to hear, as long as I can give them new and interesting and cool stuff, but it was always interesting to hear that. Challenges, we don't like doing the same old boring thing, a lot of us, getting things done. I mean, I think in a way you could sort of put this together, this list, and it's a bit of a, how would I say, sort of a psychological model of, to a degree of developer. I don't want to sort of box someone in quite that much, but improving your self-worth, we talked about that one, being in a position of influence. Okay, if you want to be a team lead or something, cool, great. Like I said, these don't always apply to everyone. Belief in your product, again, okay, cool, great. I mean, yeah, if you don't believe in your product, you're probably not going to be at the company very long. For many things. The money, we talked about that. Fancy coffee machine, fear of getting fired. Oh man, if you're doing it for that reason, get the resume updated. Being respected by your fellow team members and manager, that's always nice. Working with awesome people, that's cool. So it's an interesting list, right? But nothing in there we didn't talk about. The closest we got to talking about tech was number, two, three? Number two, learning new stuff and making, well, let's say 2 and 3, learning new stuff and making a work of art. So that's interesting. I had this list of 13 things. How many of those do you get asked about in an interview? How many of those do we talk about, or pretty much any Security Weekly podcast talk about, right? There's so many of these things going on that are actually driving people to do what they do that are, security is sort of an afterthought. Let's be honest, unfortunately. So once we know that, this is why a lot of my thought process goes into now, like once we know that security isn't our core focus, how can we make things easy enough that people can either embrace security along the way, or it doesn't annoy them? Or as I was asking Hillary, how much does this go slow down our users? So that's sort of the, do we have to listen to 10 more hours of the John and Mike show to figure out how to secure this stupid AirTag, or so that's, how do we get things done how do we take the psychological ideas behind why people are here and fit into that is something of importance to me.
It is important, and it speaks to the idea of just understanding behavior and understanding incentives as well. Because just to start out of the gate, if we're framing the conversation as developers don't care about security, we're already assuming their own mental state, and we're putting a fault on them. If instead we're figuring out what motivates you to write software, are you writing something like some beautiful code, that sort of work of art as you're describing, I think on number 3, or just learning something new. There's learning something new as an aspect of switching your front end or back end from perhaps JavaScript and NPMs over to Golang, and maybe using protobufs rather than JavaScript objects, and avoiding prototype pollution in the first place? Or, and this is where I wanted to tie it into a couple other articles from this week, or are you incentivized or supported in what you're able to do? And one of the articles that I pulled out was Google, their Google Open Source Security Team, which has a wonderful acronym of GHOST. But they were investing into the Linux Foundation to fund hardening. So last couple of episodes, I think we've been focusing quite a bit on more bug bounty. Here's another bug bounty. Here's another bunch of companies with some deep pockets funding more bug bounty awards for open source software, which is great because that research should be awarded to find vulnerabilities. But fundamentally, I think a lot of these developers know that their software has issues out there, or their software could benefit from a re-architecture, or as the Linux Foundation is focusing here, and the sos.dev, which great URL, they're focusing on what can we do to harden the build process, go through a couple different steps of code review, branch protection, a lot of things I think that you were kind of alluding to, John, in our last segment with Hillary as well. And they're, rather than just saying the old school type of AppSec approach, here's the list, go do these 12 or 13 things, come back and let us know when you're done. Not very collaborative. Instead, they're saying, we're going to finance you. We're going to help you do this. Here's a list of 10 or 12 things that have pretty clear actions that we also believe make a process more mature and improve the security. And so rather than just tell you what you should do and walk away, we're going to work with you on it. So that's why I wanted to highlight this, because I think it ties into a lot of what you were describing there in your other article as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. And there's been it's funny that the way you're framing it is much more interesting than it sounded in my head for the last week or two when we've talked about this, or we've seen some of these things. Because unfortunately right now, just think of I'm going to talk about the other guys a little bit almost, but think about the time mark we've had over the last year or two of going from like, oh my God, the single company is going to spend $1 billion on security, to coming around to seeing these guys now say, hey, 10B, and I think it was 100 or 500 mil for external. I don't have the link in front of me. There it is. 100 million for a third party. That's a nice chunk of cash. But I think it's not so much, and this comes back to exactly my thought process of, which is, it's one thing you're saying you're going to spend a bunch of cash on it, but what are you actually doing? Are you giving, copies of Microsoft Windows at list price, or are you doing something interesting? And so that support is probably almost more valuable than the cash itself, right? So one of the things we're doing at CNCF on the Security Technical Access Group is we're trying to figure out, can we do something called a Security PAL, which I'm sort of leading, and try to figure out how do we go out to open source teams and, hi, I'm from security, I'm here to help. But I don't want to scare or offset or set deadlines or bug that group. But at the same time, I want to say, hey, if you got questions either about CNCF or security or how do we get you guys graduated, there's a bunch of us here that are happy to talk to you and walk you through some of those things. If you have questions or you don't know what a CVSS score is, or all these different types of things, how can we help you? So that's super valuable and super useful. Because again, like I said, think about average open source team and those 13 points I just talked about. Those 13 points are for someone why they get into software, not even why they get into open source. I can tell you, right, that's really more of a pure love of the heart for those who aren't doing as part of the day job. So having someone who can come in from this side, like they're attempting to do here, I think is super cool. So that's great. More power to them.
Very cool. And I think there's also, you're highlighting some great aspects of just that basic education. We do, on the shows here, we'll throw around CVSS, CWE, CVE, etc. No need to explain what they are. But once you start talking to developers, their eyes can glaze over, because also how much should they really care about that versus, here is a cross-site scripting that impacts users of our AirTags in this manner, and we actually really care about credential theft, and so this is why. Here's some ways to counter it, versus, this is a CVSS, a 9.8 on the CVS v3 scale, and you should fix it within 1.7 days because the industry average, and hopefully everybody's eyes are glazing over, despite my excellent voice acting right there. Yes. But that I think is, I'm just really trying to strengthen that point you're making, and maybe pull in some other articles here about process. You're talking about motivation. I was talking a little bit about process in the open source, and there's also tools. Here's an open source tool from Facebook for a SaaS tool for Android and Java, basically. Okay. And now, this is again. I've seen a lot of static analysis tools come out open source from Facebook. They've got one called PIFF, lots of F's in there. There was also Infer, and now Marian Trench. And to me, I'd highlight less about that there's yet another tool, and more about maybe the motivation behind the tool, or maybe the fact that you don't necessarily have the same issues that Facebook does in terms of at scale, to use the cliche. But what's always interesting is looking at what problems they're solving, because those problems are probably consequential throughout the industry. And so here's a SaaS tool that can possibly help with Android. So let me pause there and just throw it over to you, John.
Yeah, excuse my sniggering. They Sam, one of our internals at Security Weekly, I'm sure she's got a better title, so my apologies, Sam. But she was mentioning that Facebook, WhatsApp, and Instagram are all down right now as we talk about this. And my response was good fucking riddance. Pardon my French. But yeah, no, so, I mean, again, great CA thing from Facebook, right? I mean, they... let's just address the elephant in the room, right? We know that the public questionable things going on with that group, but they've got a great security team. They've had great security people go through this. And so it's cool to see their tools are really, most of the stuff that's come out of, I mean, if you think about actually what we do on a day in, day out basis, a lot of the better open source tools which we use are coming from Facebook. So put that in your pipe and smoke it. This is an interesting one. I know there's still a ton of people doing JavaScript. So, Java. One day I'll be able to say that about JavaScript too. So yeah, it's valuable, and I'm glad to see them bring something like that out there, and it can help us. I want to go back to the previous one for 2 seconds, the Google article. Folks should go and hit up that blog, because one thing I forgot to mention is there's a bunch of good links out of it to other places. Like we talked about SOS, but also like they mentioned at least 2 different groups, both core infrastructure as well as OSSF, Open Source Software Foundation, I think it is. Both have algorithms now around how to come up with how do you prioritize and scale the importance of an open source package which you're using from the point of view of security. So how do you figure out the criticality of a package in your stack? And I think that's probably being we should probably cover that a separate 20-30 minutes, right? We should come back to that another week. But anyways, yeah, the JavaScript, cool, great, glad to see them open sourcing things. And hope our friends over there get their stuff back up online pretty soon, because I'm sure a lot of people are having to work because they can't go to Facebook.
Yeah, and I did throw in some links to salsa.dev and the OSSF scorecard, because yes, I agree, those are good actionable ways of how do you make recommendations that actually move the needle, to use the cliche of security. So check those out. Definitely, we're not trying to do some reputation laundering for our FB friends, but definitely highlighting some open source tools around SAST, or I'm going to pull in another article real quick near the end here, just about fuzzing. And there's an article here, it's more of an overview about what fuzzing is and how it can be helpful. It does have some links to additional tools. So it's a little bit more of why you should be using it rather than how to use it, just to put that in perspective. But it's a great way as you start to mature your development process. Bring fuzzing into it. I really want to push on that, because I think it can be a really effective tool if you have the people and budget to invest in doing so. But maybe one thing to wrap up on, we're talking right now, John, about developers care about security. Developers just need the tools, they need the support to be able to do security effectively, as well as prioritize it. But then there's always the basics that's going to come back and bite them. I'm not even talking about cross-site scripting this time. I'm talking about a root certificate that's expiring from Let's Encrypt. And again, this is not, Let's Encrypt is doing great work, not to pick on them, but just more of highlighting certificates expire. we actually know when they're going to expire. For those of you who want to dive in and do the mental ASN.1 parsing of an X509 certificate, just look for that expiration date. And it says, September 29th or whenever this one was. So we know that's coming in the future, but it still can be hard to keep track of, to remember, to plan for, as well as I think the bigger point I wanted to make, what happens when you have these long-term, long-lived certs, but you have longer-lived IoT devices, applications that aren't going to be easily updated or maybe don't really have any ownership to update anymore when all they need to continue working is one little cert update. I guess I'm throwing that out there as the cautionary tale for our security side of the fence to figure out what can we do to better help the developers here. So, don't know how do you think we should wrap this episode up, Mr. Kinsella?
Really quickly on that one, let's talk about availability of the CIA triad. From the point of view, as security people, we are to a point responsible for security. From an operational point of view, we should be monitoring everything. I was using Nagios, not to get out my cane, but it's not a new thing to use a monitoring tool to monitor the expiration date on your TLS cert. These guys are awesome. I mean, I've been bitten by Let's Encrypt expirations in the past. It's when you use a new, cool, great technology like that, you got to figure out what are what's our threat modeling around it. But so that said, here's where I'd like to end. We've been talking a lot recently around the big guys and what they're doing wrong and how others can avoid that. I'm sure we've got all sorts of little guys listening to us. Hit us up on Discord or email or Twitter or any of the standard ways. If you've got a problem you're trying to figure out application security wise, or something in that space where you'd hey, let's have these two guys talk about it on air and have a conversation in Discord, hit us up. Let's bring it up and we'll take your name off if you don't want your name associated with it. We won't tell your boss. But yeah, let's see if we can help other folks out there and make some of that software a little more secure in the beginning, so that we won't be talking about you after you guys go out to launch. Happy to have that and sort of make it a little more interesting for some of our listeners too.
That's a great call. And I'll even add, too, since you did mention it, that Security Pals, as you're talking about from the CNCF tag that you're participating in, come over and drop into the Discord as well. Obviously ping John about some things you'd love to hear, but possibly, too, there's some topics we could just help elucidate, to use a fancy word, along that for the developer side that we want to expand on our listenership here. So thank you for that, John. Thank you once again for being back. Thanks, everyone, for listening. We're going to return next week in a spine-chilling sequel to Application Security Weekly.